Welcome, everyone. I'm David Doctor, President and CEO of E4 Carolinas. Welcome to the review of Duke Energy's 2020 Climate Report. E4 Carolinas is producing this webinar in response to a request from and in service to its members. First of all, you get some disclaimers, and then we'll talk a little bit about the program, and I'll introduce our team that's going to be presenting today. So the views expressed in the review of Duke Energy 2020 Climate Report are those of a consensus agreement that's made between the individuals who prepared the report. And it's not the views of E4 Carolinas, its collective membership, Duke Energy, or the organizations that employ the participants to the report. This webinar is being produced to allow the origin, research, organization, and findings of that report to be presented and discussed. The webinar is not being produced to judge Duke Energy. It's about the review of the Duke Energy Climate Report. Other forums exist where if you want to judge Duke Energy, you can partake in those various proceedings and you can express your opinions. But the discussion here is about the review of the report. So more than 300 of you have registered. We have a respectable number online at the moment. So we know that this topic on climate is a passionate one for many, your moderator included. Carbon produced from power generation is one of the two major U.S. sources of carbon production, the other being fossil powered vehicles. It's important that we all understand how to reduce carbon from power generation. To maintain an orderly proceeding focused on education about the review's findings, all of you attendees wishing to address questions to the panel can do so through the web's chat function. Jess Buchanan, E4 Carolinas Administrative Manager, is online. If you have any difficulty using any of the technology on this platform, please just go to the participant or the chat function, find Jess, interact with her, or in advance, we provided you her cell phone number. You can text her and you'll find that she will solve your problem. So we ask that comments come to the chat function, and to the extent that we have time, we will attempt to address all of the questions that are presented. We ask that all participants remain muted throughout the entire webinar, and to the extent you have any difficulty with that, Jess will be able to help you, or she'll take the initiative and mute you. So now let's take a look at the program. So first of all, you're getting the moderator overview of the webinar as we have here. We've talked about the ground rules and the participants. So following this, you're going to hear from the project leaders about the origin of the study, concept, purpose, participants, the relationship with Duke Energy, recommendations. Mark Oliver from Duke Energy is going to have an opportunity for an opening statement. And then we're going to move into moderated panel discussion. We expect that to last nearly an hour. As we move toward the end of that, we'll have an opportunity to move over to the chat and look at the audience questions. And I will work through those. And as I said, I'll attempt as best possible to address all that are posed. And then we'll have a brief closing statement by each of the panel members that have participated in the study. So with that said, I'm going to move on to our panel, make the introductions. First of all, John Gartner holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a Master of Science in Atmospheric and Climate Science from MIT. Started his career as a project scientist with a research firm. Then he joined Duke Energy in 1975 as a staff scientist, project engineer. There he studied environmental factors related to power plant operation. So John is focused on this aspect of research most of his career. In 1983, he joined the Electric Power Research Institute as a project manager for environmental and risk factors related to the global fleet of operating nuclear power plants. From 90 through 2001, John held other positions with two engineering firms. With each, he was responsible again for power generating plant risk assessment and operation improvement. Joined EPRI again, where he served for 15 years prior to embarking on a technical consulting career in 2013. Most recently, he's worked with industry to define risk management, aging management, asset management, modernization needs for nuclear plant operations, extending their life to 80 years. Dr. Mike Mazzola earned his PhD in electrical engineering from Old Dominion University. Hey, Jess, we're getting a little bit of feedback. Can you check the dashboard and see where that's coming up and work with whoever is producing that to get it settled down? I'm noticing some flutter on my video also. Thank you. So Dr. Mike Mazzola earned his PhD in electrical engineering from Old Dominion after 3 years of Naval Surface Warfare Center and Eldrin, Virginia. Mike joined the faculty of Mississippi State University, where he became known for his research in areas of silicon carbide power, semiconductor device prototyping, and semiconductor materials growth and characterization. He served at the Mississippi State University Center for Advanced Vehicle Systems as the Associate Director for Advanced Vehicle Systems, where he led research in high voltage engineering, power systems modeling and simulation, application of silicon carbide semiconductor devices and power electronics, and control of hybrid electric vehicle powertrains. In addition, he served 2 years as a Chief Technology Officer of SemiSouth Laboratories, a company he co-founded. He joined UNC Charlotte as the Director of the Energy Production Infrastructure Center in 2017. Joel Porter is Policy Manager for Clean Air Carolina, where he leads advocacy efforts and creates policy solutions to limit pollution, mitigate climate change, and protect public health for North Carolinians. His previous roles include working with the government affairs team for a national trade group of energy utility providers in Washington, D.C., as a lobbyist for North Carolina municipalities and localities, and as an advocate with a non-governmental organization advocating national market-based energy and climate policies. Joel's a Kansas City native, holds a bachelor's in political science from Benedictine College, completed his master's coursework in government and security studies at Johns Hopkins University. Mark Oliver is Vice President of Duke Energy's Integrated Systems Planning Group, which includes Integrated Resource Planning, IRP, as well as Integrated Systems and Operations Planning, ISOP. So there's your two acronyms for the day, IRP and ISOP. For 6 regulated electric utility jurisdictions across 6 states. That's Duke Energy's portfolio across the 6 states of which they operate. Duke Energy's ISOP team is developing an integrated planning framework to coordinate distribution and transmission planning with generation planning to account for potential of distributed energy resources and innovative customer programs to provide value across multiple use cases, potentially deferring capacity needs across distribution, transmission, and/or generation. Mark's been with Duke for 29 years, holds a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from North Carolina State University, and an MBA from the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. So there's our team. And next, we want to move into a overview of the review that was conducted by John, Mike, and Joel. So I'm going to stop screen share. We're going to go to the speaker view. There we go. And John and Mike, I believe or is it John and Joel is going to lead us into it? John and Joel, that's right. If you would.
Yeah, thank you, David. As arguably the least qualified individual on the panel, I've been chosen to go first. Just kidding. Good morning or good afternoon, excuse me. And thank you, David, for having us this afternoon. As he mentioned, my name is Joel Porter. I'm the policy manager with Clean Air Carolina. We're a small state-based nonprofit that advocates for reductions in air pollution in our state. We're here today to discuss our review of Duke Energy's 2020 climate report and associated Duke Energy climate strategies. And before we begin, I think it's important to acknowledge that this panel does not represent the wide breadth of diversity in our state. It doesn't come remotely close. It's a bunch of white guys. So that being said, this panel is made up of a few of the participants of the review group and a representative chosen by Duke. So as David mentioned in his ground rules and opening remarks, this report does not reflect the opinions of every environmental organization in the state, or really even the organizations that employ me or the other report's authors. This report is a broad evaluation of Duke Energy's climate strategy and should be seen as a constructive starting point for the company to begin to improve its environmental footprint and to set us on a sustainable pathway to mitigate climate risk. And even as a starting point, which is really the lowest route to be picked, there are still areas of divergence between all of us. I think that speaks to the level of complexity and importance of this challenge. That ultimately is why John, our report's lead author and a retired energy expert, reached out to Duke on behalf of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Climate Leaders, or CMCL. He, like the other participants of CMCL, which is a coalition of advocates working on the City of Charlotte's Strategic Energy Action Plan, or CEAP, understands that the variable risks posed by anthropogenic climate change are very high. Now, I'm sure that many folks on this call are asking themselves, why in the world would Duke Energy want to engage a group like this on such intimate topics? Well, I'm not going to try to answer that. I'll leave that to you, Mark. But I do want to say that the company was very accommodating and supported us throughout a very long, rigorous process. They supplied us with all of the technical expertise we required and answered any questions that we brought to them without hesitation. So that said, thank you, Mark. Again, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm not sure if she's on the call, but I appreciate her support as well. Now then, our team review consisted, of 10 reviewers, which had a bit more diversity on it than this panel, with varying levels of energy policy expertise representing academia, the business community, or at least one of the business community's lawyers, grassroots groups, environmental organizations, and interested individuals. The review was done by examining publicly available materials such as reports, regulatory filings, briefings given by Duke Energy, and three-hour meetings with Mark and his colleagues. The review occurred between August and November, and the report was issued on January 12th. So with that said, let me pause for a minute. David, I think we have some slides that we need to put up. So the report was issued. The report we issued is a detailed review of Duke's strategy. And in it, we aim to show the company in a very constructive way areas in their climate plan where there was strength and areas where there could be potential for improvement. Personally, I think we achieved both. We hope this report has been and will be used as a tool, a resource for anyone to better understand Duke Energy's climate goals and show folks that there are some low cost, high reward solutions to undertake. Now, as I said, this report is just one milestone on the longer path to achieving what we hope is a cleaner energy future. There are still areas where we diverge. Some of those areas we will talk about in detail today. But most of those areas of divergent focus on how much clean energy generation we could and should add to the grid. During today's discussion, I'm sure we'll get into that deeper, but frankly, having gone through this process and having the benefit of hindsight, I think there is much more that we can and do to build on this report. So with that, John, I'm sorry that the slides aren't here, but I will turn it over to you and let you kind of get into more of the recommendations that we laid out in the report and some of the findings.
As I said, I'm John Gertner. I was the lead author of this report. Very proud of the report, and I appreciate Joel doing the introductory material. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the content of the report itself. First, going to tell you about the majority of the report, 62% to be exact, are what we call the findings. And the findings, each finding is an objective statement that's based on the reviewed materials, and it's deemed to be critical to the accuracy, completeness, or significance of some element of Duke's climate strategy. So although of the many, many things we could have said, we pulled out 47 findings where we thought were very insightful and thought-provoking. And I would encourage you to look through the findings to actually see those. By the way, he found it. There we are. That's the slide we're on. Thank you very much. You can see that these findings are categorized in 25 topic areas. So if one were to read all these findings and you read them in order, they would form a narrative, starting with this first group of findings, 1 through 7, which match up quite closely to the Duke IRP report. But I want to emphasize that we did not review their material from an IRP perspective. But we used those scenarios from the IRP report because they represent Duke's most recent and most detailed analysis for the first 15 years of their 30-year climate strategy. So they are quite relevant. Then if we move to the next group of topics, they are technologies, and the first ones are the clean zero carbon generation technologies that Duke has elected to include in their future planning: solar, nuclear, wind, storage, longer term storage, and the advanced technologies, which they call ZELFers. On the next column, you'll see some other technologies we reviewed, such as the grid, transmission and distribution upgrades, their efficiency programs, and the concept of additional electrification that could be part of the decarbonization strategy. And the final set of categories are enabling elements, things like their Duke scenario analysis methodology, their metrics and tracking, their risk management program, and the importance of carbon policy. So you can see that we covered quite a broad spectrum of topics, and for each of these topics there is one or more what we consider to be a significant finding. And so when you look at the report, you can either read it as from beginning to end as a narrative, or you can go to any specific topic just to see what we had to say about that. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because much of the Q&A will be focused on these findings, and the panel will be discussing them. So next slide, please. The next, that's the wrong direction. Thank you. After the findings, very important element of the report are recommendations that we put together for consideration of Duke Energy. So from those 47 findings, we distilled and prioritized 8 recommendations. For us, a recommendation was a call for an action on the part of Duke Energy. So we didn't give them just global, hey, you ought to do a better job sorts of things, or you ought to do the impossible. These were things that we considered to be near-term actionable items they could do that would make their climate strategy have a higher likelihood of success, be less expensive, or faster to meeting its goals. These are not prescriptive, and that was on purpose, because we want Duke to take these to heart, and we want them to craft their own solutions to address our recommendations in a way that would be most productive for them. We don't have time, obviously, to go over them in detail, but if you just read the yellow highlighted sections, you'll see the topics that we covered in our recommendations. There are technologies there, such as renewables and the ZELFers that I told you about earlier, and hydrogen and smart grid. And then there are policy issues, and then we have one that deals with their performance metrics and tracking. And we're pretty excited about these. Duke is currently considering these recommendations and what they intend to do about it, and we all might hear some news on that this afternoon. Next slide, please. I'd like to close with a few additional closing thoughts. Thank you. That are sort of conclusions that we drew. And the first of which is that, as Joel pointed out, this is a very complex, urgent, and uncertain path forward to do this drastic decarbonization. And that's not a criticism of Duke Energy or any of the stakeholders involved. It just really is a monumental job. And the complexity makes it interesting, but highly uncertain. The second point I want to bring out is that, yeah, we had a tendency to be critical of Duke, because you do that when you're reviewing someone. You're looking for the flaws. But we also found many significant accomplishments that we wanted to highlight that Duke had accomplished. Of course, they've reduced their carbon significantly in their efforts since 2005 already, and even the plan itself is quite an accomplishment. The strategy to reach net zero by 2050, but they also have developed a very competent staff using state-of-the-art analytical techniques, and we thought it was important to acknowledge those accomplishments by Duke Energy. And finally, I'd like to point out that, which is the last bullet on this slide, that success is going to require collaboration and leadership on the part of Duke Energy. And they, of course, already do that. But our recommendations and our conclusions lead us to believe that they and all of us as stakeholders will have to step up our game in order to reach this compelling goal of zero carbon by 2050. So with that, I'll turn this over to our third member here, Mike Mazzola, and see if he wants to add anything that Joel and I may have missed.
Well, no, just quick recovery, Joel. Thank you very much for getting the slides up. And I did want to mention that we're at the Energy Production Infrastructure Center. We're very fortunate, and that John asked me to be a part of the team. I've definitely learned a lot, and I look forward to the discussions in this panel. But I, again, just would suggest to you, John, to make it maybe point out again where people can download this report, because we think it's important for it to have wide distribution.
Okay, Joel, it's Joel's website, so he can say it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. That's probably a good idea. It is on the Clean Air Carolina website. Again, because the report was, I don't want to call it commission, but it came together under CMCL. Our executive director, June Blotnick, is currently the president of CMCL, and we had the infrastructure to do it. So it's currently on our website, and I'll put that in the chat, actually. One moment.
And Joel, with everyone's pre-webinar material, they received a PDF of the review report.
Our gift.
And John, Joel, and Mike, with regard to the deck that we just saw, thank you, Joel, for resurrecting it. Are you amenable to sharing that deck as an overview with all of our various registrants?
I certainly am.
Thank you.
You can also find the report under news on the EPIC website, which is epic.uncc.edu.
And are we ready now to move on to Mark Oliver for a opening statement from Duke Energy? All good? Mark, platform's yours.
All right. Thank you, David. So to give folks that might not be familiar with me a little feel for my background and where I'm coming from, I had the fortune of growing up in rural North Carolina with a rich history of small family farms on both sides of my family. And, you know, in that environment, it's important to have good relationships with your neighbors and work together with your neighbors on things. So that's part of where I come from. I also had the benefit of being able to spend most of my time outdoors growing up, and the combination of those things really instilled in me a deep appreciation for the environment, and that really shaped the direction of my career path. I started out in nuclear engineering in the early 1990s, and at that time, way back then, I had aspirations for contributing to the clean energy transition as the nuclear promise held at that time. And I feel really fortunate today to have a role in the clean energy transition that we're dealing with now. And I expect most of us here today share a goal of making progress on clean energy. For Duke Energy, serving customers and meeting their energy needs safely and reliably is really our top priority. We serve 4 million electric customers across the Carolinas, and we consistently hear from those customers that they share our goals for a cleaner energy future. We aim to deliver that future while also making sure that we keep our power reliable and affordable. Together, we've made great progress, as John mentioned, retiring more than half of our coal plants and reducing carbon emissions by more than 40% since 2005. And also in that time frame, reducing sulfur dioxide by over 95% and reducing nitrogen oxide by over 80%. But there's a lot more work to be done to reach our net zero goal for carbon by 2050. The good news is the Carolinas have emerged as leaders in low carbon intensity energy. And a lot of that is thanks to collaborative state policy. There are numerous examples of how stakeholders have come together to find alignment on policies that benefit both residents and businesses across the state. Things like the Clean Smokes Act and the Mountain Energy Act, and also more recently, the competitive procurement of renewable energy. And all those things arose out of collaborative stakeholder processes. We're committed to working with policymakers and stakeholders to develop an energy transition plan for the Carolinas that continues that progress on coal retirements, focuses on economic development and local community benefits, and builds clean energy resources, keeps energy affordable, and leverages new technologies as they become cost effective. My team really appreciated the opportunity to meet with the Climate Report Review Group last year and have frank discussions with them and share information from different perspectives. And I felt like that was a really great example of how it's possible for utilities and stakeholders to come together. And I think to the extent that utilities and stakeholders can do more of that in the future, that really improves our ability collectively to drive forward this clean energy transition. There's a few recommendations from the CERRG report that John alluded to that I'd like to highlight some progress on. So there was a recommendation, I think it was number 4, about assessing the potential to maximize renewable energy expansion. We've got several efforts underway that will help to inform our future process for studying maximizing renewable adoption. The first that I'll mention is the ongoing NREL Carbon-Free Resource Integration Study. And that is really geared toward helping build a shared understanding with stakeholders of operational and siting challenges and issues and opportunities that come with very high levels of carbon-free resources. And we're also joining with EPRI on a study that's being launched around resource adequacy for a low decarbonized future. And that's a fairly recent effort. Within the broader ISOP within the broader ISOP effort that David mentioned earlier, we're studying what's needed to make the grid ready for more distributed energy resources and wide-scale electrification. And we're also looking at how to do distribution and transmission planning in a different way to interconnect larger amounts of renewable energy more cost-effectively and efficiently. The question of how quickly we can interconnect renewables has gotten a lot of attention since filing the IRP. And I really see this as an opportunity that we can continue to work with stakeholders on and the commissions on in Carolinas going forward. We don't have enough time to go into all the details on this, but I'd like to make just a couple points here on that topic. It's probably pretty intuitive that the earliest solar projects that connect to the grid in the service area tend to pick the lowest cost, easiest to connect sites in the state. And as more and more solar is added to the system, those sites get exhausted and interconnection becomes progressively more expensive and complex, takes more time. But from 2015 to 2019, Duke Energy was actually able to connect more utility scale solar projects in North Carolina than any other state. So that's projects 2 megawatts and greater. We've worked with stakeholders over the last couple of years to reform the process that's used to interconnect solar to the grid so that that process could be more efficient in the future and cost effective. And hopefully we'll get a favorable ruling from FERC on that in the near future to move that forward. The second CRG recommendation I would mention is how to advance zero emitting load following resources, which we refer to as ZELFRs. So we're partnering with a number of important DOE projects. First I will mention is a study with Clemson and Siemens on hydrogen, use of hydrogen. We're also partnering with a company called Malta on a thermal energy storage system they have. And we're also advisors on 2 projects to construct full-scale reactors, demonstration reactors before 2030. One of those being the Natrium Advanced Reactor and the other being the NuScale Small Modular Reactor. Inside the company, we formed an emerging technology assessment team, and that's focused on screening and advancing the most promising ZELFR technologies. We also brought in a clean energy tank tank, Energy Futures Initiative, to advise us on strategy for technology selection and advocacy. And as an outgrowth of that effort, I'm happy to say that we're working with EFI to develop a regional case study on forming a hydrogen market here in the Carolinas. And we've reached out to Clemson and NC State, and I'm sure we'll be reaching out to Mike as well for their potential involvement. We're envisioning a virtual workshop in the August timeframe that's still under development, but more to come on that. We're also supporting EPRI's low carbon resource initiative. And that allows us to promote diversity in technology development by sharing costs of pilot projects with other utilities so that we can gain experience with technologies that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. And third, I would mention the recommendation about transparency on our carbon reduction efforts. We've added some new reporting in the 2021 sustainability report that maybe I'll get a chance to talk to later. And we've also started an internal effort to assess how we can provide a more complete picture of our progress on clean energy goals with improved accessibility of information through the Duke website. And to wrap up here, I think the events that we saw in February in Texas and also last summer in California in terms of outage situations that really had a pretty significant impact on customers serve as a reminder to us that we have a lot of complex work ahead of us to really understand how a dramatically different grid of the future would perform through polar vortex events and other extreme weather events. And I think it'll be even more important for utilities and stakeholders in the future to have a shared understanding of the opportunities and challenges of this transition. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Mark. And now this group has given me the opportunity to ask them some questions. We'll see if I can stump them here in the next 45 minutes or so. But while we're doing that, those of you that are online with us, if you would put your questions into chat, we'll follow those along. And if there's anything appropriate during the course of moderated panel discussion, we'll try to work that in. And then we'll definitely go to chat as we get toward the end of the hour. So I've studied the report. I watched the slides, and I see that there's 47 findings, 8 recommendations. That's a lot. So all of you that are involved in the study, including Mark, do you believe that these findings are unique to Duke Energy, or are they characteristic to some extent of issues that all U.S. electricity, all electric utilities operating generation should be thinking about? What's your perspective?
May I start?
Yeah.
Well, I think generally the findings and recommendations, unfortunately, are to a large extent unique to Duke Energy. Utilities are amazingly different. Regulated versus deregulated, strongly nuclear or not, with or without significant hydropower, or with some have a much greater solar resource than others, some have a much greater wind resource than others, some have fracked gas availability. There are just so many variables. And So they all face some common problems, but I think I guess what I would say is valuable here is the process. I think it would be useful for any utility to embrace their stakeholders and meet and wrestle these problems to a set of recommendations and a strategy as we did with Duke. But I think that it would be mostly the process and the resulting collaboration between the utilities and the stakeholders that has value. And sadly, most of the conclusions would not be easily transferable. I think Duke gets criticized a lot, for example, when compared with some of the desert states in the Southwest because they don't have as much solar or that they don't use solar storage together. That's just one example of where we want to be careful that we're evaluating it properly.
So Joel, Mike, Mark, any additional comments?
Well, I'll just say, actually, I think you might have meant wind, not as much wind as, because Duke Energy is definitely managing one of the largest solar portfolios in the country right now. But otherwise, yes, it's true that each utility is different. But I think that what is pretty interesting to me is that virtually every investor-owned utility has now committed to goals that are very similar to what is in Duke's 2020 climate strategy. And the need for the science of solutions is now very, very real. And so anything that we do that ultimately leads to a successful resource mix will certainly be found to be, I think, similar at most other investor-owned utilities.
So, fairly unique to Duke Energy. Are you aware of other studies nationally to give us some perspective here on what you've accomplished? There's been a lot of work done with regard to carbon related to power generation. Are you aware of other studies that have really undertaken a deep dive like you have into particular utilities to give objective insight as to their carbon reduction plans?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. So I actually think I would diverge a bit from John's response and probably agree more with Mike. I think there are some things that our report detailed that are very specific to Duke, but there are other recommendations that can be, I think, as Mike was saying, can be nationwide. And yes, there are other reports out there that are doing very similar, I guess, taking a similar approach. One that I am aware of was recently put out by C2ES, a DC-based think tank. I happen to have done some work with them before, and I'll put that report in the chat. They did a great webinar on it last week with Arizona Power and Light and a few other utilities, and really got into some of the regional challenges that I think exist. So it's worth checking out. And but I'd say generally, yeah, I think there are some overarching things that each utility is going to need to keep in mind as we're moving through both the policy, political, and even the planning processes that everyone is so steeply and deeply involved in. Excuse me. So yeah, that's kind of where I land on it, having thought about that a little bit.
So, Mark, Mike, any follow-up comments with regard to other studies that you see out there that have taken deep dives into electric utilities? So let me move on to John. Yeah, so
I'm not personally aware of any, David.
yeah, so John, again, 47 findings, 8 recommendations. That's a lot. Do we have like the 80-20 rule operating here, where there's 20% of these recommendations are going to get us 80% of the way there? what's the most important recommendations made that will enable Duke Energy to timely meet their North Carolina climate goals? Or is it the whole portfolio? What you're thinking?
Yeah, well, we're probably going to have the same disagreement on this one that we may have had on the last one, because I would take the position that when I go through those 8 recommendations, it's hard for me to take any of them out. It just seems they're all very important, but it is an interesting exercise to try to say, okay, suppose you had a gun to your head, what would you, what would you say? I would say that an argument I would make is that if you just took the 2 recommendations, the one of maximizing the renewables in the short term, and then making sure you have the adequate advanced technologies that you'll need in the longer term, that those 2 alone would be very powerful, because they would increase your likelihood of success tremendously and your speed of achieving decarbonization. So one could take that position. I don't know whether it's right, but you could do that. Another one you could take would be, and I think Joel would agree with this, is in many cases there are policies, not technology and not cost, but policies that are in the way. And we've mentioned some of those already, slowing the inability to get the transmission of power from its source to the customer in time, because we have long queues of people waiting for approval of and evaluation and approval of their transmission. That's one. Another one is the carbon policy, the price on carbon that would be important. So if we could just maybe focus on the 2 recommendations that address policy reform, that might really enable us to move faster on many different areas. And then finally, there's the one on the metrics and the tracking and the feedback. What that's designed to do is to, as Mark pointed out, he said they've committed to work on that particular recommendation, and they see the value in it, is that if you monitor your performance and how you're doing on your strategy, and when you see it's not going well for whatever reason, or you get information that indicates something may not work that you'd plan to do in the future, if you take an immediate corrective action, then you haven't wasted time and money. You've adapted immediately, and you have a good chance of succeeding. So even that recommendation alone might be the most important. But I think it's very difficult for me. I really think this is a case where you need to have many parallel paths in action at one time in order to succeed, because none of us can predict which of the many problems is going to be the one that is most important. So you have to be prepared for many at once. So I guess that's a long answer, but that's the way I would look at it if I were Duke Energy.
So let's leverage off of a point that John made here and pull a question out of chat. And this is for everyone, but can you dig down a little bit deeper and share some more insight as to the role of analytics, the role that analytics can play in advancing us towards net zero emission strategy? And specifically, where can Duke Energy better employ or more extensively employ analytics in its decarbonization effort? Any thoughts from any of you on that?
I'll trust Mark to take a shot at it.
Yeah, I would.
That's his job.
Yeah. So I'll start. Maybe it'll inspire some other thoughts. I think one of the challenges that we face, as many times mentioned earlier, that it's really complex analytical work. And so just even within the areas of expertise between national labs and utilities, there are often gaps in terms of perspectives on the appropriate modeling approach for various things. So I personally feel like the work that we're doing with NREL on the carbon-free resource integration study, where they're independently working on an assessment for our service area and we can work directly with them to understand differences in modeling techniques that they're using versus ways that we approach it. I think just going through that process is helpful for both the utility and the national labs, because I think they're beneficial perspectives on each side that we can both learn from. And I think to the extent that national labs and utilities can come together more in terms of what they're seeing as the potential for the future and the cost of those transitional changes, I think it will be more compelling to policymakers when there's uniform agreement. And so that would be my take on that question, David.
Yeah, as follow-up, and I'll shock John here, I agree with you. I think that recommendation number 1 is probably the most important one. EPIC is the technical lead for a project sponsored by the State Energy Program, which is a program out of the U.S. Department of Energy that involves the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. The State Energy Director, Sushma Bazemore, is the lead of that. And we support her in a program that is labeled Planning an Affordable and Resilient and Sustainable Electric Grid. And what we discovered is we're in that program, we are developing new metrics to try to bring in new considerations that this recommendation talks about, which is ways in which decision makers can have new ways of properly understanding the value of that sustainable resilient grid. And when they do so, then they can properly assign resources to that. And it's interesting, we've had tremendous statewide involvement. It was part of the program to have stakeholders. Duke Energy is a partner in that. We really appreciate your support, Mark McIntyre, Mark Oliver. And so we've had 2 of our 3 planned statewide stakeholder meetings. And in one case, a North Carolina sitting member of the North Carolina Utility Commission got in, and they comment, this idea of including the value of resiliency against, let's say, hurricanes, and reducing the experience of customers with power outages and the life-changing effects that occurs when you're out of power for a week or a month, is all well and fine, but state legislature or state law doesn't allow us to consider that in determining what is a least cost. And so there we can develop all the technology we want, and we can develop all the planning tools and metrics that we want, but it has to translate into a different way of doing business.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to move over to Mark. Mark, at the federal level, we've seen several carbon reduction proposals. We don't necessarily have a federal carbon policy or law. We've got, the executive branches has cited intentions. So how has Duke Energy been thinking about addressing these federal level proposals? And do you think that's going to influence the IRP process going forward?
Thanks, David. So we have been constructively engaging policymakers in DC to understand the policy proposals and also to share our perspective on technologies that are needed to achieve our 2050 net zero goal. And we see support of public policy as really necessary to achieve our net zero carbon goal by 2050. In addition to the carbon price mechanism, we also need new technologies, and we need streamlined permitting processes and approval and construction processes to enable a more rapid transition. So there's a good analogy here for what happened with COVID and the federal response to vaccine development, streamlining regulatory processes, and serving the public interest, the greater public good in that way. Our IRPs currently include a carbon price trajectory, and that serves as a proxy for various carbon policies that have been put forward over the years. And a carbon neutral federal carbon policy, from my perspective, is really the most effective in affecting resource planning decisions and real-time operations in a way that is beneficial, not just locally, but globally in terms of the total emissions of the state. If we have localized state carbon price, there's the potential for carbon leakage because you're interchanging energy with utilities outside of the footprint, outside of the state, and that can create potential for leakage. So definitely, from my perspective, the federal carbon policy is preferred over the local. In terms of how we would include that in the IRP, as we see these policies taking shape and we start getting a sense of which ones are more likely to be successful, we can develop scenarios in the future IRPs that either represent them directly or represent a reasonably kind of bounding scenario around a group of policies. And so that's the way we're thinking about that, David.
Carbon pricing. Let me look. It took us 53 minutes to get really interesting here. So we're treading into where there are not rules right now. So Joel, how about a follow-up comment? I know Clean Air Carolina has a petition asking the state to establish a price on emissions. So talk a little bit about how that would help Duke Energy meet its climate goals, and how was the decision to undertake that effort related to your discussions?
Well, I want to be real clear here. Mark, did we just hear you support our petition? Is that an endorsement? Are you making news today? I thought we weren't going to do that. I thought this was going to be a boring, wonky webinar.
Yeah,
Man.
So I think the powers that be have just disconnected Mark from the webinar.
Hopefully, back. I'll have to make that same again.
Yeah, he just lost bandwidth. So back at areas, back on track, Joel. Come on, what's going on with Clean Air Carolina and the petition?
I wasn't asking the question.
No, it's good you were gone, Mark. Don't worry about it. We do have a petition. We're involved in a petition for rulemaking with SCLC and the NC Coastal Federation. I don't know that I would say that our decision to do that was fully based on our discussions with Mark and Duke, but they definitely did help. We did see the benefits that they did, that Mark was just alluding to. There will be a substantial amount of renewable assets added to the grid using a carbon price. And as Mark was alluding to, I won't pretend that that joining RGGI is the end-all be-all solution that we need to really address this problem. As he was kind of alluding to, what's ultimately needed is something from the federal level. And even then, you have to design a policy that really incentivizes the international community to do more, because Duke has done a lot to decarbonize. Other utilities have taken similar pledges. This is a problem now that is global. And as you look at the different policies that you can employ, you start crossing those off real quick, right? And this is something that I've even been thinking about in terms of the North Carolina environmental community, because at the end of the day, there's only one policy out there that can incentivize international action. And that, quite frankly, is really a carbon tax, because you can throw on a carbon tax what's called a carbon border adjustment. And the only way to make that WTO compliant is if you have a direct price on emissions. So a renewable portfolio standard won't do that. To the best of my knowledge, a clean energy standard, to the best of my knowledge, won't do that. It's got to be a direct price. And that's why, going back to the earlier question about what the most important recommendation was, I think, John really got to the crux of this. That's number three. That's lobbying, and that's being transparent. And Duke has started to do some of that, and I do acknowledge that in publishing the list of trade associations that they belong to, and beginning to align their climate goals with their trade association dues. So I would love to see more work on that, and I think there's a ton more that could be done. But having been a federal advocate for carbon pricing, I can tell you, Republican offices, this isn't their top priority. It's not even close. Not even close. And until utilities are in offices at the state level and at the federal level, really clarifying the issue and the problem as it exists in its entirety, it won't get the attention that it really needs and deserves. I think the administration is starting to take a different tact and really focus on the jobs aspect that clean energy can provide. That's a good start, but we need more engagement all across the board, and really highlighting the pros, the cons, and being honest about the entire thing, about the entire issue. So
I'm going to take one more step into this. This is really a fascinating area. So Joel and probably Mark, you talked about carbon tax. Now, a carbon tax for a generator would add cost, probably be O&M if you're looking at a rate case scenario. So, you're going to get the cost of carbon input that way and spread across the various rates. But there's other aspects, and Steve McDowell puts a question in chat here with regard to least cost, because in addition to simply, distributing cost for rate making, there's also least cost consideration with regard to power generation. So, an approach to incorporate the cost of carbon into least cost assessment actually would require policy change at the state level, where it would change the way that the regulators were required to take a look at a utility's least cost structure. So is that another step that we might eventually see with regard to carbon management of any utility in the United States? Joel, Mark, any thoughts on that one?
Mark, you wanna go first, and I'll follow up, or I'm happy to take it to you.
You probably have more to say on this than I do in terms of your expertise, but Joel, I think there are some states that do have social cost of carbon prescribed as a factor to be considered in resource planning, right? So, I mean, that is one option available to the states to do. And there are potentially different levels, but what we come back to is our kind of fundamental tenets of reliability and affordability for the customers, because we want to make sure that, especially those that are least able to afford cost increases can manage that. So that's a very important consideration in any policy discussion. So I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, that's right, and I think we'll see what comes out of the legislature here shortly next week, and I don't want to delve down that rabbit hole. But I was on the NCUC's public hearing on the IRP last night, and I know there are some NCUC staff and commissioners on the call. So I'm going to take a privilege here and just say thank you very much. The call went from 6 to 8:30 p.m. and the commission was very patient and understanding and did just a wonderful job of letting people get their voices heard. And I think that's important. So I did want to just mention that here. But I think that how these questions, how we make sure that the sort of, we've talked about this before, David, but the intangible costs are accounted for. I think there are a variety of ways to do that. I know we need to do that. But I think we're starting to see intangible costs becoming more tangible, right? Like the the things that before were not quantifiable, we're starting to be able to see those costs realize, and we're having to pay for them up front now. Whereas before, that wasn't really the case. So the problem's getting worse, and as it gets worse and worse, we're gonna have to pay for these things more. So I think it's being proactive and changing the way that we account for those costs should change sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Mark. So Mike, over to you. Leading up to the point of developing momentum, interest, awareness with regard to the need to better manage carbon from all sources, cities, counties, states have established aspirational goals, and they've been largely established based upon, the thought we need to advance ourselves as opposed to a lot of fact. So we're to a point now where we've got to implement, and we need facts upon what to act. So how do you see academia playing a role in helping to advance people properly towards these aspirational goals, and even at the state level, implementing Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80 and the objectives there. So what role does academia play?
Well, certainly we like to think of ourselves as a resource of innovation. And the challenge now, though, is that discovery, invention, and innovation have to happen at incredible rates in order to meet goals and schedules that are coming from what I, perhaps correctly, there's uncertainties as well in the science of the problem. But if the science of the problem is driving things, where does the science of solutions get to drive things? And I think that's a very, very important point that has to be taken into account. And it's something that John and I have had some very deep conversations about, and is reflected in certain findings and recommendations of this report, which is, as we select scenarios which involve selecting solutions, we have to be careful about assuming that those that what appear to be either the most desirable, politically favorite, or popular solutions don't lead to a situation where we fail or find ourselves failing at a date that we have that becomes hard to recover. So I think we need to stay the course a little bit sometimes with respect to our schedule, so that the science of solutions can be there and give us the highest probability of being successful. A little bit too slow absolutely has costs that we would like to avoid, but significant failure has much higher costs, and so we have to be mindful of that. You're on mute, David.
I'm on mute. So I'm going to stay with you and move on to another point that actually focuses more back on the review of the report. And let's look at advanced generation technologies, specifically the zero emission load following resources. And there's been diversity of opinion with regard to them. Between Duke Energy's planners, climate advocates, whether things are necessary and feasible versus they're not necessary and they're imaginary. So how do you see this sorting out? Did the report itself bring any clarity to it? Is there more work that needs to be done? Where are we with this?
Well, it is kind of interesting to me that the Zephyr topic has become one of those lightning rods a little bit for those disagreements. And the fact is that the Zephyr technology, or the underpinning technology for the Zephyrs, as we understood them from Duke during the study, are not really that controversial. They're not really space age or anything like that. It's really more amount of, in the case of small modular reactors, for example, retooling an entire way of building nuclear plants and having a supply chain and things like that. Those aren't really engineering challenges, and really nothing in the plans for small modular reactors represents new science, the way, for example, thermonuclear fusion does. Thermonuclear fusion has still some Nobel Prizes ahead of us to make that really work, but not fission nuclear. So it really comes down to policy, economics, and marketplaces. And I think that, in my opinion, that's what characterized the other sulfurs as well. And so, but don't underestimate that those are really big issues. In fact, they're bigger issues often than the invention part. I've been visiting with the now Senior Vice President for Energy Resources at EPRI, Neil Wilmshurst, who is a valued member of the EPIC External Advisory Board. And we're working together to define what we actually think are the biggest issues with getting to sulfurs in that supply chain. Because the amount of gigawatts that have to be, and hundreds of gigawatts that have to be brought into production in order to achieve these goals globally is beyond the scale that most people can really capture. And so it's the scale of factories, manufacturing, tooling up, bringing the capital to bear, making a few mistakes and solving those problems and getting systems that work. Those are the issues that have to be compressed into this time scale. But I wouldn't say that the sulfurs are by themselves should be controversial in terms of technology. We know how to design and make them. Well, we know how to design them. It's yet to be seen whether we know how to make them at the scale that we need.
Let's move over to Joel. Joel, deployment of renewable generation. Everyone recognizes that it's essential going forward. But you know, the review that you conducted finds that Duke Energy and climate advocates have different strategies despite extensive analysis and debate. So how do you see this? What are the reasons, and how did this review and its recommendations help kind of bring clarity and close that gap?
Well, I don't want to speak for other organizations. We certainly don't represent the entire advocacy community in North Carolina, but I will say that speaking for Clean Air Carolina, and having gone through the last iteration of congressional inaction, that did lead us to seeing what needed to be done on the state level. We basically, what I'm getting at is, in 2007, Congress failed to act, and there's always the possibility that they could blow it again. So frankly, that's ultimately why we said what we need to do is this petition for rulemaking. At the very least, we need to join RGGI. That will ensure that the necessary renewable assets get added to the grid that help Duke meet their goals. So for us, that made the most sense. It's affordable. It's something that can be done. We recognize that, sure, there are political considerations that may come into play here, but I think those are manageable. I did notice in the chat a gentleman referenced electricity price increases, and that's important. But we think the Utilities Commission has a very important role to play, and I think there will be more coming out about that, and they'll hopefully step into that role in helping address those concerns. So that's all I'll say about that. But yeah, the advocacy community is fairly splintered on this topic right now. Some have very valid environmental justice concerns. But again, I think those can all be alleviated through proper policy advocacy and through proper policy development. And we're working to accomplish that.
And Joel, I think your acknowledgement previously of the Utility Commission in North Carolina and its ability to bring stakeholders together and help navigate these issues is appropriate. They've done an excellent job. We've got a great commission that sits right now. And I think also our policymakers in North Carolina have been responsive and they've been intelligent about creating policy. So, we have good resources there. I'm going to move over to Mark. Mark, we get to talk about natural gas. So with regard to natural gas, the review examined natural gas. Duke Energy has a continued reliance on natural gas. Basically, the idea is that until advanced technologies are ready, after 2030, natural gas is going to continue to play a significant role. So can you explain how the review recommendations that were made here can help bring understanding and bring, those that are opposing natural gas use going forward, bring them closer together and understanding Duke Energy's approach?
So I think when it comes to the topic of the role of natural gas in enabling carbon reductions and coal retirements, we often get hung up in kind of an all or nothing mentality. And it helps, I think, to step back and say, if we are going to retire in the Carolinas 9,000 megawatts of coal, is it really reasonable with today's technology of renewables and storage to expect that the entire amount of that can be replaced with renewables and storage? Or do we need natural gas in that process? And I think we can take some of what came out of the IRP as a good indicator for what the effects of that were. We, based on stakeholder input, did run a no new gas scenario in the 2020 Carolinas IRP. And that showed that as a result of imposing that limitation of no new gas, that scenario produced about 30 million tons of additional CO2 over the 15-year period compared to the 70% reduction case that we had SMRs in. And so that was in spite of having a much higher cost, $13 billion of PBR at that point in time. And so the increase in cost there really reflects one factor, and that is, and predominantly, I'm sure there are many other factors, but one big factor is that it really requires very large quantities of renewables and storage to replace long duration dispatchable conventional generation. And I'll refer here to a study that was done by the Keenan Institute that showed that providing the same level of load serving capability as 1,000 megawatts of natural gas combined cycle generation takes 5,000 megawatts of solar and 12,000 megawatt hours of battery storage. And I can put the link to that report in the chat, but it's not just Duke saying this. There are other studies out there that show this relationship between firm dispatchable resources and renewables as there being a multiplier effect on the number of new resources you have to connect to the grid, and especially if you're depending entirely on those renewable and storage resources. So I think it's somewhat of a false choice in my mind to say that it's got to be all one or the other. I think our position is that, we need a diversity of resources to account for, the uncertainty in the future in terms of how technology is going to develop, how fuel prices will change over time, and how policy will change over time. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. John, you've been too quiet for too long. So you were the ringleader of this process, and I'm interested to know. And okay, so this I'm asking for a personal opinion. So this is not reflective of your study team you put together, but personal opinion out of this process. From what you've learned, do you believe it's possible for Duke Energy to meet the goals they've stated? Would it be possible for them to meet the goals that the governor and Executive Order, 80 has laid out? What do you think's needed for Duke Energy, at least in North Carolina, to meet its goals?
Okay, well, let's look at the goals very simply first. Duke has stated they want to meet 50% carbon reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That's the Duke goal. And I think I can answer with a resounding yes. I believe that is achieved. Those goals are achievable without any, we don't need any miracles for that to occur. And since this study, I've gone around and I've intentionally sought out smart people in academia and so forth and asked them the same question to see if it's what they believe, and they believe it too. So let me just give you the basis for that. First of all, the technologies to achieve those goals, 2030 and 2050, exist. The ones to meet 2030 exist easily, and Duke has demonstrated that in their less aggressive IRP strategies. Those to meet 2035 to 2050, Mike has pointed out, they're not fusion that we need. We need reasonable deployment of technology. So I think technology exists, the policies need to change, but they can be implemented. Costs, I think Duke's analysis shows that the costs are not even that prohibitive. There may be people who object to that it costs a little bit more, but they're not terrible. So I think Duke's goals are imminently achievable at that level. And frankly, a year ago, I think when Duke proposed them, they were headlines. They were considered bold, but now they're pretty, other companies have stepped up to very similar goals. So that's achievable. Now, you asked about the Executive Order 80, which I will say is probably, you're addressing the 70% reduction goal in 2030. Is that achievable? Well, now that's a horse of a different color. Duke did 2 scenarios to see how it could be achieved. And one of those involves the pretty heavily deployment of advanced nuclear reactors by 2030, and Duke even said that's probably not going to happen. However, they do have a case which relies extensively on storage, renewable solar, and renewable wind, with no Zelfers required by 2030, and that's the only scenario Duke presented that looks achievable, but it would require offshore wind development, which has many legal and policy as well as technical barriers, and also has transmission issues. So it's not easy, but it's reasonable to pursue that one. So I think that we don't have any evidence from the Duke study that they can meet that Executive Order 80 goal. We didn't get any analysis from Duke that made us feel comfortable that they could meet it. But I believe if these recommendations are taken seriously, if Duke works to get past the barriers that are preventing it, I believe that is probably achievable also.
So
that's a personal opinion.
And that's what I asked for, John. Do you know off the top of your head, based upon the study and your following of national issues, does Duke Energy have the capability of meeting President Biden's new pledge to reduce U.S. carbon emissions by half by the end of this decade, compared to 2005 emissions? So that would be by 2030 also.
By half? Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, they've done it, or they say they're going to do it, and that's their goal, and I think they'll meet that one.
So that's done. So the tough hurdle is the Executive Order 80, 70%.
Yeah, but it's a challenge. It's not I don't think anybody, when it was proposed, I think it was a stretch goal, and I guess we're asking Duke to do, and their stakeholders, and that includes the governments that support them and everything, is instead of telling all the reasons why we can't do it, why aren't we trying to do it? It's so important, and it's not that big of a stretch. But Will we make it with the current level of effort? Probably not. Somebody needs to step up, address the real barriers, and overcome them. Isn't that what those of us in technology, that's what we're trained to do? Those of us in politics, that's what we dream about doing. So I don't understand why we won't do it.
I'm going to ask Joel about the dream. So Joel, the one pathway to Duke Energy Executive Order 80 attainment, it appears, there's offshore wind, there's increased renewables and so on. It sounds like there's policy work that needs to be done there. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the right assumption. And I think the report that I put in the chat function at the beginning of the call addresses some of those challenges and some of those policy goals that need to be addressed. And that's the C3S infrastructure report. Duke has a ton of renewable assets already in its portfolio. Imagine what we could do if we could move those assets around the company to the places that need them. They've talked about STEAM, a regional market. I think that could really help them more easily meet their goals. And I don't want to endorse STEAM, but I will say that it's at least a start. I think those of us in the environmental utility would probably want to see more of a like RTO type of structure, something that's more regulated, but that's another time. So yeah, I think there are a ton of things that we can do. Everything from siting and permitting reform to investing in those Zephyrs that Duke says it needs.
Thank you, Joel. So I've focused on clearing a number of questions from chat. There are great questions in the chat. I hope the speakers are looking at chat. I'm going to spend the next 12, 13, 14 minutes focusing on chat, try to get us through most of those. And then as we get to about 3:05, I'm going to ask all of our speakers to give us a closing comment of 2 minutes or so. So get ready. Now this is kind of a drill down question, but this is a really interesting one because we've been focusing on power generation, which is, one of the two big carbon generators, but we're going to move over and look at EVs for a minute because it ties back to power generation. All right. So when you think about, and Mark, this is to you, this is to Mike, you've got background here. When you think about power generation and how we move forward, the possibility of a very large increase in EV usage to address that carbon issue over on the transport side is going to put load on power generation. So, is this factored in to Duke Energy's planning process? And, particularly Mike and Mark, what do you see as issues going forward with regard to how we balance this out, the big EV push versus managing carbon from power generation? And we thank Suzanne Merkelson for that question.
Mark, I think you should lead on that one because you're the business end of that question.
Let me start and you can pick it up, Mike. So yeah, certainly, one of our potential challenges with President Biden's goal for carbon reduction at the economy-wide level is the potential for electrification, and that's certainly could help advance the economy-wide carbon reductions. But it's a lot of the analysis don't take into account a rapid load growth that could occur as you move from fossil-based heat systems to electric-based heat systems. So that's certainly one of the risks in the areas of this type of carbon reduction analysis that utilities are trying to do and national labs are trying to do. We're definitely looking for opportunities to enable electric vehicles and electric transportation, because that is really a very large section of the sector of the carbon emissions. I think across the country, that's actually the number one source of carbon emissions today, as opposed to traditionally it was the utility industry. So it's a very important one to address, and we're trying to do all we can to enable that. I think there are also potential for the electrification of transportation to put downward pressure on rates if it's done well. So, through a managed charging approach, I think there's a potential to accommodate that extra electrical need in a way that spreads out those base rate fixed costs across more customers and more megawatt hour usage. And that could serve to reduce rates for all customers. Mike, anything to add?
Just that I am an electric car owner and a very happy electric car owner. And I think, a tip of the hat to David Doctor and the C4 Carolinas team. I participated in a webinar a couple of weeks ago in which this kind of question came up. I saw a question in the chat earlier about vehicle to grid, and let me say that one of the biggest challenges that I see in the next few years, or even every day almost, that there's a strong solar generating day like we're having this spring, is the possibility of that solar generation producing a net load that goes below the base load of our nuclear fleet. And the disaster of that is not a nuclear disaster, it is a CO2 emissions disaster, because what we're doing is we're taking one zero emission resource and we're displacing a second one. And that is something that we should avoid. And one way we can avoid that is charging our electric vehicles at the time when that solar energy needs to be soaked up. And so it's not really an interactive battery opportunity with electric vehicles. I, as an informed owner of an electric car, will not allow the utility to just use my battery as almost a free energy storage element. But I do time when I charge my electric vehicle to 2 times, typically noon or midnight, to get zero emission resources from Duke Energy at those times whenever possible. And I think that is that's the opportunity that we have with a much larger fleet of electric vehicles, is to flip to Duke Energy an opportunity to soak up far more in particular solar renewable energy that is going to be coming on the line in the next few years.
Thank you, Mike. A very divergent question. This is, I'm going to paraphrase one from Howard Smith, who's the master of asking the penetrating question here. And it has to do with how going forward we calculate energy costs. And, mind your answers, because Commissioner McKissick is listening to us right now. So as we, we've opened the door, we've said, well, shouldn't we look at the cost of carbon? And then, you begin to look at, societal costs in that. So Howard asked, okay, if you open that door, do you need to be looking at, in addition to carbon, water usage, land use cost, what's the footprint, environmental impact? Where do we go with this when we begin to look forward and say, let's think about what energy is costing us all in. Joel, you want to start that one? That's a big question.
No, I don't. Thanks.
Yeah, I figured you didn't.
Actually, I'm not totally sure I'm understanding the question. So, so if you could just maybe try to rephrase for me.
Yeah, so currently under our regulatory regime, we have a fairly narrow and accounting-based look, an objective accounting-based look at, what's the cost of energy, and that's applied, over at an, avoided cost calculation to say, well, now, our cost of renewable energy when it's connected by a third party gets connected at the avoided cost. So implicit in that is, we've got all the costs. And the question here is, are we really looking at all the costs?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
No, we're not. I don't know that any policy can really account for all of the costs that need to be accounted for. And I don't know that we would necessarily want to do that, because, this is just an off the cuff answer, but it could get to the point where it's just not affordable.
Exactly.
And as we all know, we need these things. So I think there's a very delicate dance that advocates, policymakers, regulators all have to do here to make sure that the policies that come out are remain affordable and do account for some of the externalities, but at the same time allow continued use on a very reasonable basis, the very things that we need to survive. But that being said, I mean, I think there are ways that government can help ensure that not all of those costs are fully realized. I mean, everything from monitoring and creating decent regulations to keep us safe help minimize those costs, right? So, you know, it's trade-off between letting the market go out and do its thing versus having command and control versus, you know, it's finding that balance. It's finding.
Yeah, but you know what? I think it's a social contract that we have to negotiate. It is, I think we stop where we feel we're being fair and constructive, but we're never going to get it right. I think you're right. You know, we could argue all day and trying to include all the costs, but at some point we have to come up with a model that we accept as a society that's fair to the across the spectrum.
Right. And I'd point out one very tough instance of this is methane, because you're seeing so many different levels of greenhouse multipliers in methane alone. And anywhere from, you know, you have studies showing anywhere from 21 times the potency of carbon to almost 100 times the greenhouse gas potential of carbon. So how do you regulate that in a way that makes sense? And if you have, in terms of total economic decarbonization, you're getting into some really curious and tough questions that you have to ask about that, you know, that one particular greenhouse gas. So as North Carolina looks to continue to commoditize greenhouse gases through various means, what's the multiplier rate? Is it 21? Is it 100? Should you be trying to figure that out at all? What's the answer? Duke has a plan to reduce methane leakage from their system. Does that include upstream, downstream, downstream leaks? Actually, Mark, that's a good question for you. But you know, anyway, it's a good question. It's a tough one.
Yeah. So Joel, it's a tough question. I think it's an interesting question because previously we were able to resolve the issue with regard to utility regulation, the cost, you know, turn it into an equation, set it aside. And I think going forward for a long time, we're going to be in a mode where we're continually assessing the balance of what power costs us, its resilience, its availability versus, you know, all of these additional costs that we never thought to take into account. I really think that's our future for quite some time.
Yeah. David, I want to do a mea culpa here. I did give one wrong answer because I misinterpreted your question, and I don't want people to go home with that wrong answer. You asked me about the Biden 50% by 2030, and I thought you said, could Duke meet it? And I answered, absolutely. But you really asked, can we meet it for all sectors? Is that correct?
No, John, your answer was right. I was asking for Duke Energy.
Oh, okay, then great.
So good answer. No need to apologize.
And I do not apologize. But I'm glad I clarified because now I'll sleep better tonight.
All right. So I'm going to ask one last question out of chat, and then we're going to move to wrap up comments. We finish up by about 3:15, and this one goes back to Mark. And Mark, we've talked a lot about about, Duke Energy's plan for, climate attainment in this, to the extent that it requires retirement of facilities in any of these scenarios. So, do we wind up with a situation where we have stranded assets and we find that the cost of the stranded assets actually offset by, more efficient energy production or the benefit of, attaining carbon goals? What's the issue with regard to stranded assets, and what's Duke Energy's approach, if any, to stranded assets?
David, are you asking in the context of accelerating a book life date to an earlier date so that the full depreciation doesn't occur? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the question in chat is directed toward whether any of these scenarios had accelerated asset retirement, and if so, how did you deal with stranded assets? How's that for a question?
Okay. Yes. Good question. So yes, definitely the coal units do have acceleration of their dates in the IRP relative to the book life that the schedule that the depreciation is based on. And so, and there is precedent for treating that as a regulatory asset that could be recovered, on beyond the end of the service life of the asset. Or, there are other mechanisms like securitization that could occur. And so there are trade-offs with all those things. But, securitization is one of the tools that the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan Working Group, discussed. So that's one option. I think with respect to natural gas, stranded costs, if I can diverge just a little bit, I've seen some questions in the chat about that. We did test a sensitivity in the IRP to look at roughly a 30% reduction in service life, and the model still selected natural gas resources with that shortened service life, recovering the cost over a shorter period of time. So that's one way to demonstrate that there's a reduced risk of stranded asset. And another consideration here is the possibility of hydrogen generation. We certainly are hopeful for potential technology breakthroughs there that will lower the cost of producing hydrogen. I know that combustion turbine manufacturers are working hard on making those resources hydrogen capable. And a lot of the studies now that are being performed that add combustion turbine resources beyond 2030 do assume them to be capable of burning hydrogen. So I think that's one way to think about a way to manage stranded asset risk for gas units. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. So how about a few concluding comments? Let's go back to Mike. So after being with us for over 90 minutes, anything to wrap up, Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity, David. And in looking at the chat, I noticed another valued member of the EPIC External Advisory Board, Tim Fairchild, who's Director of Global Energy and Manufacturing Practices at SAS. This one's for you, buddy. In answering the question what recommendation I thought was most important, I thought number 1 was most important. But my favorite recommendation is recommendation number 7. Develop and communicate to stakeholders an integrated vision of smart grid and edge of grid technology and its contribution to CO2 emission reduction in Duke Energy's climate change strategy. In sitting through the tremendous amount of information that we received from Duke, one of the things that really caught my attention was they really tried to examine the idea of demand response. And we had a really great briefing from an outside consultant that Duke Energy had. And I heard that the consultant knew that they were there to try to contribute for demand response, a significant part to the strategy, but they admitted that it just was too hard. There was it was very difficult based on past experience to understand how much the load, the customers, us, the people who flip the switch on and off can contribute to this. And I would argue, as my last point here, is that if we're the ones that are driving the policy and voting and electing the officials that are setting these goals and they're reflecting our needs, then we need to begin to use our our edge of grid devices and become part of the solution. And believe it or not, it's not just reducing energy. Sometimes we need to increase our energy consumption so that Duke and all of the other utilities like them can successfully integrate more renewable energy resources into the grid. That is an area of innovation that EPIC is in particular very excited about, and that's a strategic research area that we think that the academia will have a big role in.
Okay, and I know that thought's going to stick with people. Increase your energy to add renewables. So Joel, how about a wrap-up thought from you?
Yeah, thanks, David. A wrap-up thought, man. We've covered a lot of ground today, so one wrap-up thought is kind of difficult, but I think I'm happy to hear that Duke is using this report. I hope they continue to. I hope they continue to engage with us and the broader environmental community, and hopefully try to strengthen the relationship between us. Because I think it's important. I think there's always more understanding on both sides that can be achieved. So I hope this report laid a foundation for that. In crafting the report, we didn't really have a bunch of principles that we laid out that we tried to follow. We, out of kind of happenstance, and this is really the result of John, and I can't thank him enough for all of the hard work he put into this, was a series of recommendations that ultimately the company could unilaterally take on itself. They'd be low cost. They would be, things that we thought they could actually achieve. Again, didn't have those principles going into it, but in retrospect, those are the principles that we think, that I think that we employed, and that I think Duke could probably continue to use. So I'm very happy with what we've done here. I think there's more that can be done with it, and you never know, maybe there's another iteration. John, you want to do it again? Mark? So anyway, thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity to be on here with you guys today, and I appreciate the audience tuning in and listening to us talk about such a nerdy subject for so long.
And Mark, we're going to give you an opportunity to make a closing comment to which Joel can't respond.
Perfect. Let's talk about, so I'll make one quick mention of our methane goal announced last fall after the IRP was published, by the way, that we've got a goal of net zero methane by 2030. And we've also joined a coalition of natural gas companies called One Future that's working to reduce methane emissions. And really, another aspect of that is trying to make sure that when we do source natural gas, that to the extent possible, we're preferencing utilities that are being responsible with methane leakage control. One of the things that we've done is we've spent over $1 billion replacing pipe to reduce risk of methane leakage. We've also increased monitoring substantially, and we're working hard on that goal. I did want to just say thanks for this opportunity, and especially a shout out to John. I think he deserves a lot of credit for how well this went off. We really appreciated the opportunity for constructive engagement with CRRG, and it really felt like there was a good constructive tone throughout the process, and everybody seemed to really appreciate the opportunity. I think one of the most important things for people that are thinking about trying to replicate something like this is to make sure that before the engagement starts that you have a good understanding and agreement on what the overall objectives of the work are, the topics and the approach. And I'll say that John was just great to work with in that regard, and was really well organized and helped it be the success that it was. So hats off to John for that.
Thank you, Mark. And John, in just a minute, you get the last word. But first, at the request of my friend Mike Smith with the Electric Cooperatives of South Carolina, he wants you to answer the question as to whether you think the entire sector can attain Biden's goal of 50% reduction by 2030. So now you get to answer the question again.
Okay. Well, I'll combine that with my closing statement.
Perfect.
It was 30 years ago that we all knew the sources and severity of climate change, and that we knew what action was imperative. If we, not everyone took the time to bother, but those who did knew it. And we've wasted those 30 years to a large extent. And there have been more greenhouse gas emissions in those 30 years than all the previous industrial emissions. Now that takes your breath away to think that we've done that. So we're here. We're not there. We can't turn around. But we have to take it very seriously. We can't just say how well we've done and, oh, well, we still need to do this carefully and slowly, and we don't want to go too fast. And I think it's time to figure out how to get it done without making these terrible mistakes. And the way you do that is you start now. I don't want this report to be just put away now and everybody say we learned something and we adjusted our vectors and now we're moving in a slightly better direction. That isn't good enough. I think we need a living program of moving forward. Every day we come to work, we need to ask, what did we learn yesterday that means we have to change something we thought was right yesterday but slightly wrong today? We need a dynamic process. And if we do that, and we have a lot of the tools that Mark's group is using, they are wonderful tools. They are a part of the new modeling and simulation revolution that we're seeing in decision making and planning. And Mark has those tools, and he's got the staff that knows how to use them. And the beauty of those tools is when you learn something new, you put it in your model. And before the day is out, you have a new projection, a new result. So we can be dynamic, but we don't have time to make any more mistakes. So now, in answer to that question, can we meet the Biden objectives, which are very aggressive? I don't know, but we have to try. And if we fall short while we tried our best and did our best, then that's the best we could have done. But if we don't do our best, if we always have an excuse why we can't do it, or we can't go that fast, or we can't spend that much money, then we will fail and we'll deserve it. So that's the way I feel. I feel this is, I know this report isn't that big a deal. I'm very proud of it, and I want to thank everyone for the nice things they said about me, but everybody pitched in. It was wonderful. And it's just one small piece that we can use to contribute to this progress. And I think we have to do that.
Well, John, I couldn't say anything more to enhance the message other than to say thank you, Mark, Joel, Mike, and John. And I thank everyone in the audience for being a marvelous audience and providing us marvelous questions. Thank you all.